I remember the exact moment the table went silent. My fiancé's mother had just passed the bread basket. My fiancé was refilling his father's water glass, and his father, a man named Douglas, retired cardiothoracic surgeon, 41 years of hospital politics and medical hierarchy built into the way he held his fork, was halfway through telling me why young doctors today didn't really understand patient care. He wasn't looking at me when he said it. He was looking at the centerpiece, a low arrangement of white hydrangeas his wife had clearly put effort into, and he was speaking the way certain men speak when they believe the room already agrees with them. The problem, he said, is that medicine got too comfortable, too corporate. The residents coming out of programs now, they know how to document, they know how to bill. But actual clinical judgment? He set his fork down with a small, deliberate clink. That comes from years, you can't shortcut it. My fiancé sitting beside me shifted almost imperceptibly in his chair. His mother reached for the salt. Douglas picked up his fork again and looked at me directly for the first time since we'd sat down. "No offense to anyone at the table," he said. "I know you work in the medical field. Administration, isn't it?" I folded my napkin in my lap, met his eyes across the white tablecloth, and said very calmly, "Actually, Douglas, I'm the new chief of surgery at Whitmore Regional." For a moment, the entire dining room seemed to hold its breath. The candles didn't flicker. The low jazz his wife had put on in the background kept playing, indifferent to everything. Douglas blinked. Just once. But to understand how we arrived at that moment, how a dinner in a Connecticut suburb became the most quietly destabilizing evening of Douglas Hale's professional life, you have to go back about 3 weeks. I had just signed my contract with Whitmore Regional Medical Center in Fairfield County. The ink was barely dry. My name was still being added to the department directory, and the outgoing chief of surgery, a man named Dr. Osi, who had run that department with extraordinary steadiness for 17 years, had handed me a coffee mug that said Chief on it in faded block letters. He said, "The mug's seen better days, so has the department, you'll fix both." I was 33 years old. I knew what that meant to people when they heard it. I'd watched it happen enough times. The slight recalibration behind someone's eyes, the half second where they decided whether to revise their assumption or just hold on to it a little longer. I didn't take the chief position because I'd spent my entire career wanting a title. I took it because Whitmore's surgical outcomes had been declining quietly for 2 years, the kind of decline that doesn't make headlines but shows up in the data if you're paying attention, and I had spent the last decade paying very close attention to data. Before Whitmore, I'd been a general surgeon at a Level I trauma center in Boston. Before that, residency at Johns Hopkins. Before that, medical school, and before that, a childhood in rural Ohio where the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away, and I watched that distance matter in ways it shouldn't have. I understood what surgical access meant. I understood what surgical failure meant, and I understood more than most people my age what it meant to walk into a room and not be who someone expected. My fiancé, whose name is Ben, had known about the Whitmore offer for months. He worked in medical device sales, which meant he understood hospital systems and procurement cycles and the particular exhaustion of a job that never really clocks out. We'd met 2 years earlier at a conference in Philadelphia, which sounds very sterile and professional, and it was, but there was also a moment near the end of the second evening when we ended up at the same corner of the hotel bar arguing about hospital consolidation, and he made me laugh in a way I hadn't in a while. He knew my rank, he knew my CV. Outside of work, we rarely led with it. There's something that happens when you tell people you're a surgeon, especially when you're a woman in your early 30s. Conversations tend to reorganize themselves around the information. People recalibrate. Some of them become warmer, more attentive. Some become subtly competitive. Some, and this is the group I find most exhausting, start speaking more carefully, which sounds like a good thing but often just means they've decided you're fragile and important rather than simply a person. I liked being just a person when I could. Ben understood that. He was good at creating spaces where I didn't have to perform credentials. When we were together on weekends, I was mostly just someone who overcooked pasta and had opinions about documentary films and fell asleep reading on the couch. It was a relief, honestly, in a way I didn't know I needed until I had it. About 2 weeks after I signed with Whitmore, Ben came over on a Tuesday evening with takeout from a Thai place we liked and that slightly careful expression he gets when he's thinking about how to word something. We ate for a while before he said it. "My parents want to meet you." I smiled. "That's reasonable." He nodded. Then very deliberately, he set down his fork. There's something I should tell you first. I leaned back in my chair. That phrase, in my experience, has never once preceded good news. Ben rubbed the back of his neck. My dad, you know how I mentioned he's retired? I did. Douglas Hale had been a cardiothoracic surgeon for 4 decades, had trained at Yale, had built a career defined by a specific brand of surgical excellence that people of his generation carried like identity rather than profession. Ben had mentioned him in passing, always with a kind of careful affection that told me the relationship was complicated in ways that didn't get fully explained. He has some opinions, Ben said, about medicine, about where it's headed, about younger physicians. He paused. About women in surgical leadership specifically. I didn't react immediately. I'd heard variations of those opinions before. I'd heard them in attending lounges and at department meetings, and from colleagues who thought they were whispering, and from patients who thought they were being complimentary when they said things like, "You don't look like a surgeon." "Okay," I said. "He's not. He's a good person," Ben said quickly. "He's just from a different era. He built his career in a time when surgery looked a certain way, and he's never entirely updated that picture. And he doesn't know what I do." Ben got very still. "He knows you work in medicine." I looked at him. I may have told him you were in hospital administration. The room was quiet for a moment. "Ben, I know. You told your father I was an administrator." I panicked. He had the decency to look genuinely embarrassed. He started asking questions before I could think, and I knew if I said surgeon he was going to. It was going to become a whole thing, and I wanted him to meet you before it became a whole thing. I thought about that for a moment. It was not, I decided, an entirely unreasonable impulse. Misguided, but not unreasonable. And now? Now they want to have us for dinner, Sunday. At the house in Westport, I sipped my water. Ben watched me with the careful attention of someone who wasn't sure whether he was about to be forgiven or have a very long conversation. "I'll come," I said finally. He exhaled. "Yeah? I've presented surgical outcomes to hospital boards and testified in front of state health committees," I said. "I think I can get through a Sunday dinner." He laughed, which was clearly involuntary and slightly helpless. "My dad can be a lot. I understand that. He likes to be the most experienced person in the room. Most people who've spent 40 years being the most experienced person in the room do." Ben smiled, but there was something behind it. Something he didn't say. I noticed it but didn't push. I would understand it better by Sunday evening. The drive to Westport took about an hour from the city, through the kind of Connecticut landscape that manages to be beautiful without being showy. Low stone walls along the highway, October color just starting in the maples, the land rolling gently toward the sound. Ben drove without talking much, which was unusual for him. He was a talker generally. The quiet told me he was running through scenarios in his head. I watched the road for a while before I said, "You're nervous. I'm fine. You've been gripping the steering wheel with both hands for 40 minutes. He glanced at me sideways. "My dad can be intense. You said that already. I'm emphasizing it." I smiled. "Tell me something concrete," he thought for a moment. He believes medicine is a calling that most people today have turned into a career. He believes surgical training has gotten soft. He believes that seniority is the only reliable proxy for competence. Another beat. He also believes that women who enter surgical specialties often do so in support roles, and that leadership positions should be earned through the kind of long-form mentorship he experienced, which basically means being trained by someone who already looks like him. I turned toward the window. Outside, a gas station gave way to a farm stand that was closed for the season, the empty wooden bins stacked neatly beside the road. He said that explicitly? Not to me directly, but I've heard him say it at the table before, when he doesn't realize anyone's listening. I nodded slowly. That particular species of prejudice, the kind that survives in private, that presents publicly as reasonable and even principled, was in many ways harder to address than the overt kind. You couldn't point to it. It lived in assumptions. "He doesn't know what he's walking into," Ben said. "No," I said. "He doesn't." We pulled off the highway and onto a surface road that wound through a neighborhood of older colonials, set back from the street behind mature trees. Ben's parents' house was a federal-style home with white columns and a wraparound porch, the kind of house that had been lived in long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. A BMW was in the driveway. 2 planters of late-season chrysanthemums framed the front steps, yellow and rust. Ben parked and turned off the engine. He looked at me. "You don't have to be patient with him," he said. "I know. If he says something—" "Ben," I said gently, "I'm okay." He nodded, but I could see he wasn't entirely sure I would be, and I understood why. He'd grown up managing that dinner table. He knew what it cost. Douglas Hale opened the door before we reached the top step. He was taller than I'd expected, trim, white-haired, with the kind of posture that doesn't come from vanity but from decades of standing in operating rooms where slumping was not an option. He had the eyes of someone who was always at some level making an assessment. He shook Ben's hand first, a firm, brief father-son shake. Then he looked at me. "Meredith," he said, "Ben's told me about you." "Good things, I hope," I said. "Enough." His handshake was evaluative, not unfriendly, but not warm either. Just informational. Ben's mother appeared behind him, and she was immediately different. Her name was Patricia, and she had the easy warmth of someone who had long ago decided that life was too short to perform anything. She pulled Ben into a hug that he disappeared into briefly, and then she turned to me with a smile that reached her whole face. "Finally," she said. "Come in. I've been telling Douglas all week I was excited to meet you." The house smelled like roast beef and wood smoke. A fire had been lit in the living room fireplace, and the mantel held framed photographs. Ben, as a teenager, ski trips, what looked like a medical school graduation, Douglas in scrubs, looking younger and certain of everything. We moved into the dining room. Patricia had set the table carefully. Good china, a low centerpiece of fall flowers, the kind of tablecloth that comes out for occasions. Douglas sat at the head. I sat across from him. The first part of the evening was pleasant. Patricia asked about where I'd grown up, and I told her Ohio, a small town outside Columbus. Douglas asked about Ben's drive up, and Ben told him about a project he was working on. Patricia brought out the food: roast beef, roasted vegetables, dinner rolls still warm, and for a few minutes the conversation stayed on the surface of things, which is where all family dinners live until they don't. Then Douglas set down his knife and looked at me with the focused attention of a man who had decided it was time to be thorough. "Ben said you're in hospital administration," he said. "Which department?" "I work across departments," I said. "Operations, primarily." He nodded. "That's important work. Hospitals don't function without people keeping the machinery running." "That's true," I said. Ben reached for a dinner roll. "What drew you to the administrative side?" Douglas asked. He was genuinely curious, in the way that people are genuinely curious about something they've already decided doesn't require deep engagement. "I've always been interested in outcomes," I said. "Systemic outcomes. What's working and what isn't." Douglas seemed satisfied by that. "I spent 40 years in the OR. The administrative side was never interesting to me. Too far from the patient. I understand that perspective." He picked up his fork again. For a moment I thought we might coast through the whole evening on that shallow channel. I was almost looking forward to it. But Douglas was not a man who could leave important subjects alone for long. He began telling us about his training. Yale, the program director who'd shaped him, the hours, the cases, the period in the 1980s when cardiac surgery was evolving so rapidly that every month brought a new technique and you either kept up or you didn't. The stories themselves were genuinely interesting. I recognized the names he mentioned, the milestones, but underneath them ran a current I had learned to recognize over years. The current that said, "This is what it was, and it was better then." "The residents now," Douglas said at one point, with the patient resignation of someone explaining something they've explained many times. "I'm not saying they're not smart. They're very smart. Probably smarter than we were in certain technical ways. But there's a kind of judgment you develop over time that you cannot accelerate." He looked at me. "You probably see that on the administrative side. People who have the credentials but not the depth. It happens," I said. Ben said nothing. Patricia refilled the water glasses. "The mentorship has deteriorated," Douglas continued. "Programs are shorter, the hour restrictions." He shook his head. "I understand the intent, but when you pull people out of the OR at 80 hours, you're interrupting something. Learning that happens through repetition and pressure and the specific discomfort of not knowing and having to figure it out anyway. That's a real tension in training," I said. Douglas looked at me with what I'd describe as approving surprise, the expression of a man who hadn't expected the administrator to say something substantive. "Yes," he said, "it is. Most people outside the surgical environment don't quite understand it." Ben looked at his plate. Douglas continued. He moved from residency hours to surgical culture to the specific decline of what he called earned authority, a phrase he seemed to return to the way a person returns to a comfortable chair, earned authority. The idea that position meant nothing without the accumulation of experience behind it. That titles given too early or for the wrong reasons were not just meaningless but actively harmful because they created a false architecture that patients eventually paid for. I agreed with parts of this. There was something true in it underneath the self-congratulation. But then he said something that changed the temperature of the room. He had been speaking about a colleague's daughter, a young woman who had recently been appointed chief of a department in New Jersey, and his tone shifted, almost imperceptibly, from general commentary to something more specific. "I'm not going to say she wasn't qualified," he said in exactly the tone people use when they mean the opposite, "but there are appointments that happen for reasons that aren't entirely about merit, diversity initiatives, optics. And I'm not opposed to diversity," he added quickly. "I just think it should never come at the expense of the best outcome for patients." Patricia set down her fork very quietly. Ben said, "Dad, I'm making a general point. It didn't sound entirely general, Daniel." Douglas used a name that wasn't Ben's, which told me this was old family shorthand and also that he was annoyed. "I'm talking about institutional decision-making, not about anyone at this table." He looked at me. No offense intended toward anyone in administration, obviously. The women I've known in hospital management have been exceptional at what they do. I held his gaze for a moment. "None taken," I said. And then I let another 30 seconds of silence pass, while Douglas reached for his wine and Patricia looked at me with the careful expression of someone who sensed that something was about to happen and wasn't sure whether to brace or hope. I placed my hands flat on the table. "Douglas," I said, "you're right that earned authority matters, that depth of experience matters, that patient outcomes have to come before everything else." He nodded. "Exactly. I've believed that my entire career," I said. "Which is why I've spent 10 years as a general surgeon, the last 4 in a Level I trauma center in Boston, before accepting the chief of surgery position at Whitmore Regional. I took command of the department 3 weeks ago." The table stopped, not dramatically. There was no gasp. Ben's hand went still beside his water glass. Patricia's face went through several expressions quickly, landing on something that looked like astonished relief. Douglas looked at me across the white tablecloth, and for the first time that evening, the assessing quality in his eyes became something else entirely. "Recalculation. He stopped, started again. "You're the new chief at Whitmore." "Yes." He stared. "Dr. Osie's position." "Yes." "A beat. How old are you?" 33. Something crossed his face that I couldn't entirely read. Not anger, not exactly humiliation. More like the particular sensation of finding yourself in a room that has different dimensions than you thought. "Ben?" he said, without looking at his son. Ben said, very quietly, "I tried to tell you. You told me she was in administration. I told you she worked in the medical field." Douglas looked back at me. He had the discipline to keep his expression controlled, but I had spent enough time in difficult conversations to read what was happening underneath it. He was replaying dinner. He was running back through every sentence he had spoken, the training hours, the earned authority, the careful implication about the woman in New Jersey, and hearing them from a different angle now, the angle of someone who outranked him, not by age, by current position, by active practice, by the specific thing he had been describing all evening as the only thing that mattered, real clinical responsibility. "That's something," he finally said. The words came out stiffly, which told me he was working hard to control his voice. "You didn't mention it," he said to me. "I wanted to meet you as Ben's girlfriend first," I said, "not as a title." He sat with that for a moment. Patricia spoke first. "Well," she said softly, "that certainly explains the patients." Douglas looked at her. "You spent the better part of an hour," Patricia said gently, "explaining surgical culture to someone who runs a surgical department." Ben had the grace to look at his food instead of smiling. Douglas set his wine glass down very precisely. He was a man who had spent a career making decisions under pressure, and I could see him applying that same steadiness to the current moment, which probably felt like a different kind of pressure. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't?" "Yes, I do." His voice was quiet but definite. "I made assumptions about your career and your capabilities that I had no basis for making. I said things that were," he paused. "They were condescending, and some of what I said about appointments and merit," his jaw tightened briefly. "I'd like to retract that, Douglas," I said. "You don't have to. I spent 40 years telling residents that intellectual honesty was non-negotiable." He met my eyes. "That applies to this as well." The room was quiet. Patricia reached over and touched his arm. He didn't pull away from it. Ben finally exhaled. "So," he said in the careful voice of someone trying to lower the altitude. "More roast beef, anyone?" Douglas gave him a look, but there was something loosening in it. Some of the evening's particular tension beginning to dissolve. After dinner, I stepped outside onto the back porch while Patricia made coffee and Ben helped clear the table. The night had turned cold the way October nights do in Connecticut, the air carrying the smell of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The backyard was dark beyond the porch light, just the silhouettes of old maples, standing against a sky that wasn't quite black. I stood there for a while. 33 years of being underestimated had taught me that the most useful thing to do after a confrontation was nothing. For a little while, let the pressure equalize. The door opened behind me. Douglas stepped out. He stood beside me at the railing, hands in his jacket pockets, looking out at the dark yard. He didn't speak immediately, which I respected. He was composing himself rather than just filling air. "Cold out here," he said finally. It is another pause. "How long have you known Ben?" he asked. 2 years. He nodded slowly. He didn't tell me much. "About you, about your career. I know, I assume that was protective of both of you, I think." Douglas turned his head slightly toward me. "What does that mean?" "He wanted you to meet me before you formed a position," I said. "And I think he wanted me to see you clearly, too, without the framing." Douglas was quiet for a moment. "And did you see me clearly?" "Yes." He accepted that without argument. That, I thought, was its own form of honesty. "My daughter," he stopped. Started again. "I have a daughter. Younger than Ben. She's a first-year resident internal medicine in Philadelphia." He looked back out at the yard. "She's told me things. About how she's treated. About conversations she's overheard. About what it costs, being taken seriously." His voice was careful, controlled. "I've listened to those conversations and believed I understood them, and then tonight I sat across from you and demonstrated exactly what she was describing." I said nothing because it didn't seem like a moment for words. "That's a particular kind of uncomfortable," Douglas said. "It usually is," I said, "when the mirror appears unexpectedly." He gave a short, quiet sound that was almost a laugh. "Yes." We stood in silence for another minute. Below us, through the kitchen window, I could see Ben and Patricia at the sink, their voices muffled and comfortable. Ben was gesturing about something and Patricia was laughing. "Can I ask you something?" Douglas said. "Go ahead." "Why didn't you correct me sooner?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because you weren't being cruel," I said. "You were being certain." And certainty of that kind, the kind that comes from genuine experience, from decades of work you're proud of, it deserves a different response than cruelty does. Douglas turned to look at me directly. "That sounds like something you arrived at the hard way. Most useful things are." He nodded slowly. "What made you want Whitmore?" he asked. "Specifically." "The outcomes were declining," I said, quietly. "Not in ways that make headlines. But the data was there if you looked. And you looked." "I look at data the way some people read before bed," I said. "It's a reflex." For the first time that evening, something in Douglas's face shifted from managed composure to something more genuine, a kind of recognition. The specific recognition of someone who encounters, unexpectedly, a person who loves the same difficult thing they love. "Ozzy always ran a good department," he said. "He did. The decline happened at a systems level, not a clinical one." "Staffing?" "Partly." "Retention. Some infrastructure decisions that were made for budget reasons and had downstream effects nobody modeled properly." Douglas made a sound of recognition. "The cheapest solution is rarely the cheapest solution." "No," I said. "It isn't." We talked for another 10 minutes, actually talked. Not the performance of conversation that had been happening at the dinner table, but the kind of specific technical exchange that happens when two people who understand the same complicated world are finally speaking the same language. At some point, I realized we were standing in the cold not because neither of us wanted to go in, but because neither of us wanted to interrupt it. Douglas called the following Thursday. I was at Whitmore in between a departmental meeting and a one-on-one with your scheduling coordinator when my phone buzzed with an unknown Connecticut number. I stepped into my office and answered. "Meredith," he said. "It's Douglas Hale, Douglas." I sat down. "This is unexpected. I imagine it is." He paused briefly. "I'll be quick. I know you're busy. I have a few minutes." He cleared his throat. "I called because I wanted to say something without the audience of Sunday dinner." I waited. "I've been thinking about that evening since it happened," he said. "Specifically about the things I said before you told me who you are. And I want to be honest with you, which is, it's harder than it should be because I've spent 40 years being right about most things, and being wrong feels different than it used to." I said, "I think that's probably what it's supposed to feel like." A brief pause. "I want to apologize again." not the reflexive apology from Sunday, a deliberate one. Because what I said about appointments and merit, about women in leadership positions, I said those things in front of someone who has earned exactly the kind of position I was implying women receive without earning it. And beyond the embarrassment of that, I'd like you to know that I don't actually believe the version of myself that said those things. I was quiet for a moment. Why do you say it then? Another pause. Longer this time. Because it's the vocabulary I grew up with, he said. Because my generation built a set of explanations for the way things were, and some of those explanations are wrong, and I haven't always done the work of unbuilding them. It was the most honest thing he had said to me. More honest than anything at the dinner table, where honesty had been obscured by authority and audience. I appreciate that, I said. I also called, he said, and his voice shifted slightly, became less formal, because my daughter called me on Monday. Patricia told her what happened at dinner, and my daughter told me I owed you more than a dinner table apology, and she was right, and I'm trying to be someone who listens when he's right. I smiled at that. She sounds like someone worth listening to. She is. I should have been listening better for years. He paused. We'd like to have you both to dinner again. No speeches this time. I'd like to actually meet you. I thought about that for a moment. Yes, I said. I'd like that. Good. He sounded quietly relieved. One more thing. What's that? If you ever need a consultant on the cardiac side at Whitmore, I'm retired, not dead. I still have colleagues in the field. I laughed genuinely. I'll keep that in mind. Ben and I drove back to Westport the following Sunday. Same highway. Same Connecticut light, autumn now fully in possession of the trees. Ben was different in the car this time, looser, both hands not gripping quite as hard. He really called you, Ben said. He did, on his own. Ben shook his head slowly, in the way people do when someone they love manages to surprise them. He's not, I want you to know, he's not usually. Ben, I know, I said. He's a person, a complicated one. That's allowed. Ben was quiet for a moment. Then, do you think it'll be different tonight? I looked out at the road. I think we'll find out. It was different, not dramatically. Douglas didn't meet us at the door with declarations or gestures that would have felt performed. He just opened the door and said, Meredith, good to see you. With a steadiness that meant it, Patricia had made the same meal. Roast beef, roasted vegetables, dinner rolls. I noticed it when I sat down and she caught me noticing. If we're going to have a second first dinner, she said, I thought we should start from the same table. Douglas looked at his wife. There was something in it, appreciation, and maybe a little sheepishness. We ate. Ben talked about a hospital system he'd been working with in Georgia. Patricia asked about my week at Whitmore. I told her about a restructuring I was working through in the scheduling system, the kind of problem that was tedious to explain and satisfying to solve. Douglas listened to all of it. Halfway through dinner, he set down his fork. Before we go further, he said, the table went quiet the way it had the week before, but differently. This quiet had room in it. I said some things last week that I want to address properly, Douglas said. He looked at me. I made assumptions about your abilities and your position. I implied that women in surgical leadership often arrive there for reasons other than merit. I said those things in front of someone who has done the work, taken the cases, earned the title. He paused. I was wrong to say them. I was wrong to believe them, and I've been doing some thinking about why I've held on to them as long as I have. Patricia was very still. Ben looked at the table. I grew up in medicine when it looked one way, Douglas continued. I built my sense of the field on a picture that had certain shapes in it, and somewhere along the way I started defending the picture instead of updating it. He met my eyes. The field I loved, the outcomes I cared about, those things don't belong to one version of who a surgeon can be. I knew that intellectually. I hadn't gotten there emotionally, he exhaled. I'm working on it. The silence that followed was different from any other silence that evening. Ben looked up finally. Patricia wiped the corner of her eye quickly, in the way of a woman who has decided she's allowed this much and no more. Thank you, I said. That means something. Douglas nodded once. Then he picked up his fork. Now, he said with something that was almost dry humor, will you tell me about the scheduling restructuring? Because inefficient ore utilization is a problem that has annoyed me for 40 years and nobody has fixed it properly. I laughed, gladly. And dinner continued, but it was a different dinner than the week before. The questions Douglas asked were real ones. The listening he did was the kind that changes you rather than the kind that waits for its turn. We talked about residency programs and outcomes data and the specific loneliness of being the first in a room that wasn't built for you, and he didn't flinch from any of it. After dessert, Ben stepped outside to call a colleague. Patricia started on the dishes. Douglas and I were left at the table, and he leaned back slightly and looked at me with the expression of a man who is genuinely revising something. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said. "What? You sat through that entire dinner last week." "Everything," I said. "And you never raised your voice." "No, most people would have maybe." He shook his head slowly. "Why didn't you?" I thought about it the way I always do before I say something that matters, which is to say I made sure I meant it before I said it. "Because I've learned," I said, "that the loudest response is rarely the most effective one. You were defending something real. The value of experience, the weight of the work. You were just applying it wrong. Correcting that quietly is more useful than correcting it loudly, because loud corrections make people defend themselves instead of hear you." Douglas was quiet for a long moment. "My daughter said something similar to me," he said finally. "She said the most tiring thing about being underestimated isn't the anger. It's the discipline it takes not to show the anger. She's right, I'm starting to understand that." He looked at me. "I'd like to do better by her, and by Ben. And if you'll give me the chance, by you." I extended my hand across the table. He shook it, firmly, differently than the first time. On the drive home, Ben reached over and took my hand somewhere around the Merritt Parkway, and we drove most of the way in the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. "Thank you," he said, somewhere in the dark stretch before our exit. "For what?" "For being patient with him. For coming back." I looked out the window at the highway lights moving past. "He's trying," I said. "That counts for something." Ben squeezed my hand. I thought about Douglas at the museum, except we hadn't gone to a museum. That had been the old story. We'd done it differently. We'd done it at his dinner table, on his own china, in the middle of the same meal, and maybe that was better. Harder to walk away from the truth when you're still sitting in front of it. I thought about his daughter in Philadelphia, a first-year resident navigating the same rooms I had navigated, carrying the same discipline it takes to stay quiet when you want to say something, to stay steady when the room has decided what you are before you've opened your mouth. I thought about what I'd said to Douglas about quiet corrections being more effective than loud ones. I still believed it. But I also knew the quiet cost something. It always does. The discipline of not reacting, of letting the moment breathe, of choosing grace over satisfaction. It isn't free. It's a choice you make. And you make it not because anger is wrong, but because you've decided what you want to build is more important than what would feel good to say. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, when you make that choice, something actually shifts. The person across the table listens differently. The room that had already decided what you were becomes uncertain, and then curious, and then, if you're patient enough, something closer to open. That's not revenge. It's not even victory, exactly. It's just what happens when dignity is the loudest thing in the room.